good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us on our very first session of 2023, and an auspicious one it is. We're talking about the 4 levers for driving value in global business services and this shift from cost to value. And we call this a fireside chat, and you'll realize why in a minute. I'm very pleased to have Phil Priest here with me. Phil is SVP of Global Shared Services at International Flavors and Fragrances, and many of you know him in his former role at Smith Nephew. So welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting me along today. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. And I'm the one on the left looking unhappy, but apparently my mother said I had a face for radio, but it's a separate story. Here's our discussion. We're going to take 30 minutes. It might run to 35, but it's a 30-minute discussion. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're trying to cover here. I want to talk a little bit about this perennial challenge about the cost versus value balance. And then I'm going to get into the conversation with Phil about these 4 levers for business value creation. And I want to kind of wrap it up with 2 key implications, which I'll share with you and discuss with Phil, because I think these are the kind of enabling things for us. And then obviously, we'd like your questions as we go through. Given the time we've got, we're not going to answer these live, but if you want to ask a question, pop it into the Q&A panel on your GoToWebinar interface, and we will come back to you by email. I'll discuss them with Phil, and just get them out there, because it frees the mind to get your questions out, and or you can always ask them by email afterwards. So that's the agenda. Very simple, very straightforward. I'll start with kind of context. I mean, I've been having this kind of discussion, an informal survey poll that's been going a few years now with GBS and Shared Services leaders, and I'm always fascinated by the idea of what's demanded of us as leaders, what the expectations and performance measures were given by our leadership and stakeholders, and the aspirations we have because we're professionals in our own right. And this is about the aspirations, not the expectations, which is interesting. So aspirations of GBS leaders tends to fall into these 5 categories. The first one is to develop an enhanced reputation as a value creator as well as cost reducer, which is kind of handy because that's the purpose of today's discussion. But it keeps coming up that you cannot cost reduce your way to success. Yes, we need to have a healthy ID cost, but we need to be very clearly and demonstrably delivering value. The second one is to become a center of excellence with the expertise to optimize and automate as well as operate, which is an interesting one because it kind of slightly creates the creative tension with the office of the CIO, who obviously looking at automation as well. But that's something we're dealing with, I think, as time goes on. The third one is the idea of end-to-end business processes, and there's a lot of discussion about end-to-end business process ownership, business process champions, and collaboration is there kind of as a catch-all because the idea of ownership, whilst it's a common aspiration, it is very rare for anybody to genuinely own the end-to-end business process cycles. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't aspire to it, but so that's end-to-end business processes. 4th is digitizing integrated processes, which clearly relates, and the 5th is making sure we develop a talent pipeline for the business, which is almost like a metric to say if your staff are being tapped up by other folks in your organization for senior roles elsewhere, you're doing a good job. It might be frustrating at the time, but it's a good indicator you're doing the right thing. So that's kind of an interesting setup to this discussion. And then it's kind of also, when we think about cost to value, it's also worth thinking about the original rationale for shared services was this idea of being able to have a centralized compliance, efficient operations, scalable, would have effective, cost delivery vehicles, and this idea of standardize, consolidate, re-engineer, and automate. So, it's understandable when you look at that, why we constantly get pushed on the cost discussion. But so it's worth coming from there, but we know the world's moved on. So let me throw a log on a fire. See that? Beautiful, isn't it? Do you feel the warmth already? So Phil, welcome. I hope you're rubbing your hands against the fire there.
I am, Dan, and you know what happens when we have a nice fire, right? So we get a dog that comes and sits near the warmth, right? So I've got She's even appeared to join us in the Fireside Chat.
I hope she's got some insights to share.
Yeah, I hope she's quiet too.
So I remember us having this conversation at a conference in London, I think in October. But before we get into that, give us all a kind of brief précis of your professional life. You know, your route to now, SVP of Global Shared Services at IFF. Tell us that route you went through.
Yeah, I guess I've taken a different path to the leader of GBS that many or GSS that many people do. Most of my early career was manufacturing supply chain. So I've been a process line operator at one point in my career when I was trying to do my degree and was doing it part time. Couldn't get the time off from the company, so swapped to night shifts and did that. I actually progressed through the lines of manufacturing leadership. I had a little back in the late 90s. Was my first foray into shared services when I did a job for a chemical company, which was about setting up a shared services operation, really customer service, logistics, and packaging were the primary pieces of that. Then went back joined Glaxo Wellcome as it was then, prior to the merger in a supply chain role. Did all sorts of roles for a 17-year career in GlaxoSmithKline in supply chain manufacturing. And then about 4 or 5 years before I left GlaxoSmithKline, a guy called Bill Louvre, who's still a good friend, got the task of setting up a core business services organization, GSK called it. And they weren't succeeding as much as they wanted to in terms of the setup of their business service centers. And Bill asked me to join his organization to run the to take control of and run the business service centers. And I said, Bill, I don't know anything about business services. He said, yeah, you do. So you work your whole time in the supply chain and manufacturing. You know that it's all about quality, cost, and customer service, right? So you do. You know what you're doing, and you've had lots of problem-solving roles. You've got a problem to solve here. So did that, set up a network of 6 business service centers, 4,500 people in there. For many reasons, change management maybe not quite good enough. Change in leadership in the company, and that strategy didn't succeed. Yeah, the business service centers still run today. They're still there. The delivery centers are still in place. And was headhunted, and I got this call from a headhunter to say, there's this company would like somebody to come and set a GBS up from scratch. And that company was Smith Nephew. That was in 2016. So in June of 2016, I arrived, and we had a very small transactional finance outsource. We had a very thin layer of HR services set up in those well-known shared service locations of Singapore, Memphis, Tennessee, and Hull. Dial on to last year when made the decision to, after we built it all and created the shared services organization, very multifunctional organization, very integrated. Hackett, so it was over 1,500 people in a company that's only 5 billion of revenue and 16,500 people. A huge swathe of the center included finance, HR, a lot of IT, real estate facilities. It even included health, safety, and environment. It was very all-encompassing. For the previous 2 years, so year-end surveys done by Hackett in the next year, we were benchmark world class, and I'm proud to say that SSON voted us in the 20 most admired last year. And I decided I needed a new challenge. I wanted to do something a little different. So I've literally 3 weeks into a role in IFF as the head of global shared services with a remit to build global shared services for IFF, which is absolutely a B2B company, but has a passion for flavors and fragrances and a want to change the way the world works, actually, and by the innovation and R&D capabilities. So I'm really looking forward to it. I know very little about it yet, so most of what I'm going to talk about is my experiences of the past. So
I understand that most of your family got fragrances and perfumes for Christmas.
Yeah, next year, Dan, yeah. Birthdays coming up.
Well, we know where to go for. So anyway, so thank you for that. So tell us just a brief kind of 60,000-foot view of the IFF landscape that you're starting with.
Yes, so it's a company that's come together as a series of acquisitions, and then one major one where IFF have bought the division, the nutritional division of the flavors and fragrances, effectively division of DuPont. As it comes together, my challenge is to build a GSS organization that helps to integrate the way that we run the core of the company. So that's what I've been hired for, and I'm just starting to work on the strategy.
You have some centers. You have some centers
around.
I've
got some existing centers that come from the legacy pieces. So we've got something in Mexico, something in Hungary, we've got something in India, and we've got something in China, and an interesting opportunity in Asturias in northern Spain. Yeah.
Very nice. Okay, well, thank you, Phil. We've got a great opportunity ahead of you, so we're looking forward to this conversation. So I'll just move from the fireplace for a minute. We had this conversation back in October. I think it was in a conference in London, and you raised this point about there are 4 ways to generate value as a GBS leader, and that really got me interested because I'm always fascinated with sharing experiences and perspectives with other leaders, and this really got me. And you know, I was fixated on this after you mentioned it. So tell me, where did you get this idea from? How did it form in your mind? And but as you talk through it, it makes sense. But I'm interested in the background.
Yeah, well, it all started with a chance conversation with a partner from Deloitte who came in to see the CFO of Smith Nephew very early on in my tenure, literally days into my tenure, and the partner at Deloitte was sharing what they call the Deloitte Enterprise Value Creation Map. You can say it in those words, so you can Google it if you want to, the audience. And basically, what it looks at, it starts at shareholder value and then breaks it down into segments, into multiple levels of actions that are categorized, then actions that the company can take to deliver shareholder value, or areas that the company can look in to deliver shareholder value. And I started to use that early on in my career in shared services, just to check that, you know, I'm connected, what I'm doing, how I'm taking cost out, or where I'm changing things, I connect to shareholder value. And then latterly, as we've got to brought into Smith & Nephew all the major candidates for what you'd normally put in a shared service, started to ask questions to myself about where else can I go to create value for the corporation now that I've got a fairly comprehensive shared service, and that's where it came from. And they start with 4 headers, and Dan, I think you're going to talk about the 4 headers in the slide.
Yeah, let's get into those. I love the simplicity of this, but like a lot of things, the simplicity at the top belies some challenge and complexity below. So the first one of these is about revenue growth. So talk to me about your view about this and how GBS can play a part in this. Clearly, revenue growth is a key part of business value, but what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, well, revenue growth starts with volume and price, right? So can you drive more volume? Can you do something about your price? And if you start to think about what we do as an organization, typically we have the accounts receivable department, we have the order management data, sometimes customer services sit sometimes in a GBS organization, and payroll data flows through there. If you start to think about that, then we have every little bit of data about the sales that we make to every customer in detail, every ship to, every owner of every ship to, and the subsidiary companies roll up, because you use that to look at credit risk. And you've got all the payroll data where you know what you're paying your sales reps in Salesforce incentive compensation. Now, you've got to be careful on privacy law, and it's got to be anonymized and things like that. But basically, you can start to pull data together to think about how, see how when new customers come on, what does that data tell you about their new customer? Has that come as a sales rep? How's that lead come into the order management system? And you can also look at when we lose a customer, you know, why we lost it. and you can see data, and you can start to use analytics to think about that data. And you can if you start to think about using analytics, a lot of analytics we use in the GBS world is looking in the rearview mirror, looking in history. But we're increasingly starting to use AI and analytics that start to be predictive. If we get good at using those algorithms on the data that we know, but the data we already, and the typical example is credit management, right? Many of you are now using predictive analytics to predict which customers we should call, because we know that they're potentially going to be a late payer or a problematic payer for various reasons. Why don't we start to use that capability on how we generate more volume or generate more revenue? That's one area. On pricing data, volume, mix, impact, what happens. You see, you can use those analytics to look at changes in that mix, and you can start to generate insights for the commercial organization to use to think about what's happening with their pricing. So, yeah. And then the one final area in this is, if you think about the order to cash process, we own large swathes of the order to cash process, but are we thinking about that process as a way to improve the experience for our customers? So are we giving our customers a great experience in the AR process, in the credit management process, in the order management processes? If we're not, we might be affecting revenue. If we do, we can help the reputation in the marketplace and increase revenue.
That's a great point, actually, because it dawns on me that revenue, whilst very important to most organizations, is a lagging indicator, and it's a lagging indicator of delivering customer value. And your point about experience is right to that. So again, if we can use data to understand the way in which we deliver customer value, the mix that delivers maximum customer value, then that will drive revenue. And I guess one other point is I know there are organizations on this call to whom revenue isn't an issue. So people in the third sector, people at the United Nations, they don't have a revenue stream per se. They're funded by donations, but they still have a customer value, a stakeholder and customer value key measure. So it does apply to every business. So I think that's a great way of thinking about things, which obviously creates opportunities and challenges. So I think we'll come on to that. But that's the first lever. And the second lever is the one about operating margin, which is obviously key to most certainly any public public organization. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, operating margin. You think of the things that affect operating margin in three buckets, which Dan's got up here, which is your SG&A costs, the cost of goods, or cost of provision of services if you're a service company, or tax. Right? GBS tends to focus in the SG&A area, but taking costs out the support functions through using GBS to improve sort of end-to-end processes. Now that's one area, but the area of improving your customer interaction efficiency, like the example that I just used around the experience that they have with your AR teams, can be somewhere that you can move further into in that process. There's the idea of thinking about what you can do to support the marketing and sales organizations with analytics and capability of those types, which you get good at because you use them on yourselves. Cost of goods typically isn't an area that GBSs get into unless they're providing services into supply chain. But if you start to think about product costing and analytics in the procurement and supply chain organizations, and analysis of input material spends or input material services, teardowns, the capability to create an organization that can do a teardown for a procurement organization that can then go and do better in their ability to negotiate with suppliers or resource in a different way, is also a really large opportunity. Then tax, intercompany flows tend to flow through our organizations. You see the full extent because we produce all the balance sheet documents and the data that goes into the P&Ls. You see the full full flow through of where profits captured, and having that dialogue with your tax organization. So how can you work with the tax organization to enable them to have, you know, the pricing calculation engines for intercompany trade, for example, working really, really superbly, having some offshore management capability, being really great, analyzing indirect tax and direct tax, many opportunities in the tax area through providing insight and analytics to your tax organization.
That's a great point. And when you talk about cost of goods sold, you've got insight into data on direct suppliers, pricing, quality, timeliness. You've got the master data. You've got a lot of tools and dials at your disposal with the right data, clearly, to drive some insights into that.
Absolutely, Dan.
So let's talk about asset efficiency. This is an interesting one. Sweating your assets.
Yeah, this one isn't something that naturally goes all the time to a shared services organization. Although some shared services organization include real estate and facility management in there. So if you start thinking on the plant and property area of this, I had real estate and facilities in my remit in my Smith Nephew role in the past. And there are lots you can do, linking broker data to your internal utilization data to start to optimize leasing costs and utilization of your let's say offices. But then when you think of a company that may deploy capital through consignment arrangements or optimizing investments in inventory, all of that data is flowing through. All of the data that flows through the systems around, the value of the inventory, where it is, where it moves from through intercompany trade, or it moves into the company from external sources, or indeed moves out as a sale. All of that data flows through your hands. Yeah. So integrating that with, partnership with supply chain planning teams, and actually maybe even bringing supply chain planning into the GBS/GSS organization gives you a whole opportunity to improve predictive analytics, using external data to improve forecast accuracy, and then essentially you're leveraging the source to pay end-to-end process to innovate with solutions to improve asset efficiency, but also the traditional candidates for improving receivables and payables.
Yeah, that's a great point. So asset efficiency is your third lever, and the fourth lever is expectations, which seems a little subtle. So tell us about that.
Yeah, this one takes you to a little bit of a different place. But if you think about a world-class GBS or GSS organization, what are we good at? Well, we're good at project and program management because we can do great transitions. And quite often, if you've done multiple transitions, you're doing things in parallel. So that program management capability of looking at synergies, interdependencies, risks, issues, you get really good at. I personally believe the change management needed to create a GBS organization is probably as big a change management capability as any company ever needs, because you're basically taking people from a high-cost location and you move them to the low-cost location. You're taking empires off senior leaders and putting it into a GBS organization. And when you move that high-cost to low-cost location, you're taking that little problem solver, the problem solver that the man or lady that you used to go down the corridor to go and ask to solve your problem. You're taking them away from every employee, and even worse than that, you're making them redundant because you're putting them offshore. So change management has to be a capability they're actually amazing at in GBS. And then many of us have strong process improvement capabilities, Lean Six Sigma groups that improve our processes and process improvement capability. If you take all of that and you say, I can apply that capability to improving the outcome of projects and programs that the company as a whole, and then the company can go, when they go to the street, to say, here's what we're planning to do. If that capability is applied really, really well, then what they say they're going to do is much more likely to occur. because you're good at it,
Mm-hmm.
because you've got proven capability and you can make it happen. And other areas where you can improve, if you help the business create an FP&A center of excellence, for example, good financial planning and analysis, good work on the plan to results process and budgeting and forecasting can help the performance management of the enterprise. That again makes you more predictable to shareholders, makes you more predictable to people who might want to buy your stock, and therefore can enable the company to improve its expectations in the marketplace and be valued higher. And then there's a final thing, something I did internally. So when I was looking at our customer effort scores and our closeout scores for customer satisfaction, you quite often have a comments section in there. And what we did was apply sentiment analysis to those comments and see what sentiment was coming back from our employees who were using the services in GBS. And it occurred to me to think, well, how often do we use sentiment analysis tools to understand the sentiment of our external stakeholders, whether they be customers, shareholders, whether they be analysts, right? And social media posts and listing services are the norm in a consumer goods organization. But how often do we use that to understand the sentiment of the stakeholder population and turn that into a service that can generate insights for the leadership of the corporation to think about where we go to generate a better expectation in the marketplace to make us a stronger company in the eyes of potential future shareholders or current shareholders or indeed analysts. So that's a very different angle, but all the skills that we possess in a GBS organization.
It's interesting. It's a great lesson in making sure across business in all disciplines, we set expectations that we can meet or exceed, not expectations that we slightly under deliver on. So I appreciate that. So you've talked about 4 levers here. You've talked the revenue, customer value lever. You've talked about the operating margin lever. You talked the assets lever and the expectations lever. Now, we've talked about this at length, Phil. There's 2 key implications that come out of this to me. One is this idea to execute on these 4 levers. You have to, as a GBS organization, have to have this end-to-end view. You have to develop and sustain shift-left thinking across the organization, which I'll talk a little bit about. And then the other part is we talk a lot about data and analytics and data-driven decision making. We've got to do that well. And there's kind of a slight Dunning-Kruger effect in that at the moment, where everyone assumes you've got the data, let's go. And of course, there's a bit of complexity in there, to say the least. So shift left thinking, this is the idea that in GBS, we typically are operating the right-hand side of processes, whether it's the customer to cash, whether it's source to pay. We're typically operating, owning the right-hand side of that. But the issue is to understand and align with those left-hand side pieces to really get close to those points you've talked about in terms of revenue, margin, asset efficiency, the rest of it. So this idea of developing a capability to think, first of all, for everyone to recognize we're part of an end-to-end cycle and we've got to understand the left-hand side, and the fact there's some kind of ambiguity in that, right? So we've got to be comfortable with ambiguity. And I love this little cartoon. It's kind of, it's helpful. The number of times you hear, people on the right-hand side of any process talking about the left-hand side, people not understanding, and the left-hand side people talking about the right-hand side, people not understanding. That's something we have to break down to achieve these goals. And this is a great conversation we had. Shift left is great. You've got to earn the right. So talk a little bit about, you introduced me to this trust equation. I love this. So talk a little bit about that, Phil.
Yeah, well, so for all the things that I just talked about, to earn the right to be able to play in that place, as you know, in process improvement, if you improve the upstream, the downstream is easier. If you buy compliantly on a PO, the downstream is easier. But to have permission to go and work in the upstream, then you have to have credibility. So you have to generate credibility from what you do in the GBS, GSS space. And when I talked about an example of this, like say in the analytics area, if you're producing great analytics that you can show are improving your services, and you can generate some insights from those analytics, you start to establish credibility in analytics with your own organization, and therefore you earn the permission. Similar thing happened to me on the program management office. I put program management, Lean Six Sigma, and change management together, and actually drove a lot of transitions that went really, really well. In fact, one, I've never seen a transition go from red to green during transition, but one went so well, it went from red to green. So that established credibility for me in the organization. And now that I've left now, but that organization, Smith Nephew, now supports the transformation office for the CEO. It established credibility. But credibility isn't a one-off. You have to keep repeating it. You have to do it over and over again. You have to show that your delivery reliability is high. And that's a difficult thing for shared services organizations to do, because once you start being really, really good at delivery, nobody's complaining, so everybody forgets about you. So then the only thing they ever hear is the thing that goes wrong, and so they have a perception that you're poor at delivery reliability. So you have to work hard at that and communicate it, and make sure that you're constantly delivering to high expectations. The third thing that really matters is you get close to the business. If you want to be really, really good at shared services, you have to really understand what the business is trying to do, so that your shared services, your business services, deliver in a way that means that the people in the business can get what they want without having to go through complicated loops or difficult explanations or whatever. But for you to be able to design services like that, you have to get really close to the business. So if you get really close to the business, you have high reliability and high credibility, and you truly understand that business, what the business is trying to achieve. Not only do you run great services, but you start to understand where you can add value, as I was talking about in the previous slides. But that gets destroyed completely if it's all about GBS, GSS, your shared service, because trust is built by the business seeing that your desire is to enable them to do more, be better, sell more, make more, discover more, etc. So think about it in a way that if we're selling GSS all the time, and maybe we might be slightly destroying trust, rather than if we're building credibility, reliability, and intimacy, and selling the idea that the GSS organization is there to enable the success of the whole.
That is really great, Phil, and that's relevant to everybody in business, whether in GBS, whether you're business partnering, finance, manufacturing, whatever. It's a great equation. So appreciate that. And I guess one other element to this is, we look for people with the smarts to do the job, and the smarts, the ability to be able to operate in the silo, get above, manage the broader issue, and see the end to end, which we talked about, those different levels, the helicopter view. But all of these four levers also require a great deal, and shifting left clearly requires a great deal of emotional intelligence as well as intellect. So it's that balance of IQ and EQ, which is a key thing which we need to develop. So that's talking about this, this key enabler, the key implication, the shift left. And the other key enabler you talked about was data and data-driven decision making. I just, I'm sure anybody who's been on any kind of conversation with me knows about my preoccupation with the Dunning-Kruger effect, where we, when presented, smart people, when presented with a problem, we kind of have a high degree of confidence in our ability to solve it, even if we have no experience in it. Once you have the misfortune to dig into it, you realize, actually, this is harder than I thought. And if you're lucky enough to become a subject matter expert on the right-hand side of that curve, you become confident, but never as confident as you were as a naive optimist, which is that's scientifically proven, but it's kind of an interesting thing if you think about it yourself, because we all fall into that. But on the data thing, that one of the challenges and the myths that I think kind of holds us back is there is this belief that if we've got this massive source of data, which is great, we've got all the data in the organization in GBS, and as a result of our IT investments, we have data lakes and ERPs and all this good stuff. And if we just take that data and we deliver it into smart, predictive analytics, we've got all of the benchmarking and dashboards, that's wonderful. We've got all the tools, all the investments, and you get this great user experience. But the bit that that we see that people are kind of constantly missing is three big challenges, which are really much harder than this bit. One is the key business questions. What are the key business questions we're trying to answer? And the fact of the matter is, data people assume business people know what they are. And the fact is, even as a business leader, the key questions are really hard to work through. They're thorny, they're gnarly. And I know, on an annual basis, at least, I'm going through this myself, and it's really, you have to really kind of wrangle it to work out the question you want answered, let alone the details of the data. The second piece is the Rosetta Stone, the kind of the translation, the semantics of what does the data actually mean. Well, we've got the same data in lots of different places at different stages of the life cycle. What do they actually mean, and how do we interpret that? And the third piece is the algorithms you talked about to drive data enrichment to produce a result. And I think, if we're going to create this capability and address these four levers, we need to really spend more time on those top three rather than just hope that the bottom two are going to deliver the result. And here's a little example about key business questions, which I love. It makes me laugh every time I see it. But this just, if you're struggling to believe what I'm saying makes sense, is if you were to say to me, how many countries are there in the world? I'd say I don't know, but I can Google it. Well, it turns out I can't, or I can, but I get 6 equally accurate answers. And if you can look through that, you see that, and that makes you laugh. But then you think it's the same if someone says about margin over the past 6 months, bad debt, the revenue in our strategic customers. It sounds like a simple question. When you dig into it, there's actually 6 different answers to that question as well. So you have to go back and say, what did you really mean when you said that? So in this case, you say, why did you ask me how many countries are in the world? Because there are 6 different answers, which are all accurate. What problem are you trying to solve? And I think it's a really interesting challenge that we all have when looking at data, because everyone assumes the key business questions must be obvious. Let's wrangle the data. Well, as you can see from this, it's simple. So the nub of this is some of the key questions we have to ask ourselves in addressing your 4 levers. Some of the answers aren't as simple as we'd like them to be. It's the road less traveled. So just put another log on the fire as we come to a conclusion. Phil, what's your thought about those? In your experience, those 2 things about the end-to-end processes and the challenge with data, the opportunity, but the gnarliness of the business problem. What's your view of those?
Yeah, it's hard, Dan. That's hard miles. It's hard slog. And nobody's data is perfect. No one. Everybody you talk to has challenges with their data. The job is to make it good enough to be able to create insights that are meaningful, and to understand the business enough to be able to share those insights in a way that the business colleagues that you interact with can use them and enhance them to grow the business. But no doubt about it, and it has to be a big partnership with IT. IT have to create the infrastructure, the data architecture, the data policy, and you have to work with business colleagues who know, the data stewards are quite often called, who know actually what that field should say. Mm-hmm. But the GBS organization can sit in the middle and help orchestrate that fit between where IT would like data to sit in their architecture and their policy, and where the business would like to use it. And then you can actually help the change management of that process to make things improve by supporting your colleagues in that data management process. But this is hard. It's difficult. It needs credibility, and you have to generate that from what you do for yourselves in the traditional areas of GBS.
So it's all about collaboration, effective collaboration across the organization. So I'm conscious of time. I did say it'll be a little bit longer than 30 minutes. We're running up 39 minutes. It's been a really fascinating conversation, Phil. I do appreciate your time. I know you're a busy man in a new role. Everyone here, if you have any questions, as I say, if you haven't popped them into the interface now, just pop me an email. I'll put my email address up here. I'll discuss them with Phil. If you've got no questions, that's fine. It's just that I do want to give everyone the opportunity to kind of let this sort of create some thoughts. Phil, I'd like to thank you so much for your time. I think it's certainly been an education for me. I think it's been an education for everyone here. So best of luck in the new endeavors, and appreciate your time.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to everyone who's listening on the call. Hopefully I've generated some ideas that you could use.
For sure. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Bye, everybody.